For most people, gender is not a complicated issue. Usually, we don't stop to ask what men and women are, as we take it to be too obvious a matter to ask about. But it is an issue of importance to feminists, who have pointed out that the matter of what makes us women, or men, is not as straightforward as we are encouraged to believe. Is being a woman a matter of biology? If it is, does that mean that it is a matter of a person's physical shape, genitals, chromosomes, hormones, or some complex calculus of all of these? Or is being a man or a woman a matter of adopting certain characteristic styles of dress, sexual preference, bearing, and demeanor? Or are women simply those who self-identify as women, who think of themselves as women and expect others to relate to them accordingly, for instance by using the pronoun she to refer to them and granting them access to women-only spaces such as women's public toilets? The answer we give to these questions can have important consequences for theory and practice. It will determine the population we are talking about when we say things like women are oppressed or women must liberate themselves. It will have bearing on questions such as the extent to which being a man or a woman is seen as a pre-given and relatively fixed, or as something subject to our individual or collective voluntary control. And it can even influence whether we see men and women as fundamentally alike or as fundamentally different. This short lecture doesn't seek to provide or promote any one particular definition of woman. Instead, I hope to clarify what it might mean for feminists to ask for or to offer an account of what women are, identifying at the same time some pitfalls feminists might be in danger of falling. One distinction which has been very important to feminists, but which has also been criticized by some of them, is that between sex and gender. The standard or traditional account has it that sex stands for traits or differences that are seen as biological, universal, natural, and fixed. For instance, it is thought that the chromosomal makeup XX is for women and XY for men. Gender, on the other hand, is taken to refer to those traits that are related to, or at least correlated with sex traits, but which are seen as socialized, culturally and historically variable, and hence changeable. Things like clothing, conformity to certain norms of appearance, career choice, and so on. Faced with the claim that it is just natural that women should be the main carers for children, some feminists, for example, have argued that this fails to distinguish sex from gender. That women give birth to children and are the only ones able to breastfeed may be natural and inevitable. But if women tend to do more of the child care than men after they cease breastfeeding, or are more likely to report a desire to do so, or to experience feelings of guilt or inadequacy for not doing so, then this might be put down to social factors. More generally, the distinction has been used by feminists to show that many things that have been traditionally relegated to natural distinction between the sexes are either plainly false or products of contingent processes of socialization. As an example, think of the belief held by many up to the 19th century that women are unfit for rational thought, and thus for professions such as medicine, law, or academia. However, as I already hinted, the distinction between sex and gender has come under criticism from some feminists, who think that the distinction is not radical enough, or that it concedes too much to biological essentialism, or to the idea of a purely natural category of sex. So, the problem, it is argued, it's not that some things belong to the category of gender, have been mistakenly attributed to the category of sex, so that we need to put more characteristics in the gender box, as it were. But rather, the true problem lies with the category of sex itself, and with the way in which it is contrasted with the category of gender. Let me try to explain that. Feminist critics of the sex-gender distinction take issue with the category of sex and with the uncritical endorsement of the idea that sex is the biological and natural basis which underlies gender. They are attacking what has sometimes been called the coat rack view, A person's sex is the structure on which various possible identities may be hung. While this view allows that you can hang more than one thing on a given structure, or that you can hang the same thing on different structure, it is still problematic because it depicts the notion of sex as something fixed and clearly distinct from gender. Moreover, even if a structure may not strictly speaking dictate what sort of things can be hung on it, there are usually certain things that fit better than others. Think back to the clothing metaphor. Some types of clothes fit better on some body types. So, while sex and gender are supposed to be clearly distinguished on this view, there is a sense in which one might say that sex extends into gender. While it would be misleading to say that most feminists who use the sex-gender distinction are committed to this implication, there is nothing in the distinction itself to preclude it. I should also add that while the sex-gender distinction is often presented as a feminist invention, upon closer inspection there is nothing particularly feminist about the idea that there is a social dimension to differences between men and women. Nor is the recognition of this dimension particularly modern. What do I mean by this? You often hear that the sex-gender distinction originates in the work of psychologists in the 1960s who introduced it in order to describe the phenomenon of transsexuality. Transsexuals are those whose gender identity does not match their biological sex. Even if this is true of the English term gender, which was used interchangeably with sex before that, it hardly follows that there was no recognition before the 1960s of the social aspect of man or womanhood. For instance, 14th century Sunni Muslim scholar Ibn Qayyim discusses unutha or femininity, femaleness, as a quality and set of skills that women are taught. So, I said that the distinction is not intrinsically feminist, but that is not to deny its potential for the feminist movement, which lies in the possibility of moving things from the sex to the gender box. If something is gender, the thought goes, then it can be criticized and changed. So the question becomes, how much can we get away with by putting in the gender category? Which in turn is linked to the question of how much of the social world can we attempt to change? Because, remember, what is in the gender box is meant to be changeable. Critics of the sex-gender distinction hold that this is the wrong way to view things. The point is not to preserve half of the dichotomy, the gender bit, and to ditch the other half, the sex bit, but rather to change the way in which we look at both and thus overcome the dichotomy. A very reasonable question. What does that mean? Feminist thinkers have cashed out this idea of overcoming the sex-gender distinction in different ways. But here are a couple of points of commonality. First, there is the proposal that we should change the way we think about the category of sex by abandoning the idea that it is either simple or unitary. For when one asks what it means to be of one sex or another, one comes up with a list of criteria, not a single candidate. Males have XY chromosomes, testosterone, a penis, and testes. Women have XX chromosomes, estrogen, a vagina, and ovaries. So it is more about a cluster of properties. And some of these properties can come apart, as in the case of people categorized as intersex, when, for instance, the XY chromosomes come with a body type and genitalia that are female in appearance. Then there are all the secondary sexual characteristics, which sometimes fail to match the internal markers of a biological sex. The fact that these criteria can come apart is taken to show not only that sex is not a unitary sort of phenomenon, but also to challenge the idea of a strict binary division between male and female. A note on the binary division and intersexuality. To clarify, according to the conventional understanding of the sexes, there are two of them, and they are mutually exclusive, an either-or business. The phenomenon of intersexuality points to a revision. Either male or female are not the only categories, or they are overlapping. It should be said that intersexuality need not be particularly common to pose this conceptual challenge. In fact, it's almost impossible to say with confidence how rare or how common the phenomenon of intersexuality is, for many a reason, so I won't go into that. What I mean is that even just the conceptual possibility of intersexuality might trigger a questioning and perhaps a revision of the traditional ways of conceiving of sex differences. A second issue that feminists raise with respect to the category of sex has to do with it being characterized as natural. Since sex is defined in terms of a set of physical, biological, natural things, the implication is that sex differences are natural differences, whereas gender differences might not be. So the problem here is with the term natural and how it is understood. One interpretation which has been contested is that natural phenomena are somehow fixed or unalterable, obtaining independently of environmental factors. Sticking to the case of sex differences, one might say thus that it is natural for girls to begin menstruating and developing breasts as they mature. But even this is dependent upon environmental factors, namely them receiving appropriate nourishment to go through puberty and the types of development that lead to menstruation and developing breasts. Also, sex characteristics often seem not to be fixed but changeable by deliberate or non-deliberate human intervention. Things like hormones can be altered by medical treatments, genitals can be altered by surgery, hair removed by waxing, and so on. So perhaps what we mean by natural is not something that is completely fixed, unchangeable, or separate from the environment, but rather what is natural is what obtains or should obtain in the normal run of things. For instance, we class the capacity of women and not men to breastfeed as natural because we believe this to be true of women across all human societies and because we see little reason to expect things to change. The problem pointed out with respect to this interpretation of the term natural is that it is not merely descriptive but also value-laden. Saying that some sexual characteristic is natural in this sense implies that we also think that the generalization holding is a good thing, or that the conditions required for the generalization to fail would be fairly drastic or traumatic or detrimental in its side effects. The general lesson from this criticism should be that what we count as being natural is also always relative to our context. That is, our range of experiences, imagination, technological capacity, and so on. To wrap up, the feminist critique of the sex-gender distinction starts by noting that sex is a complex category, a cluster of criteria, rather than something single or simple. It also points out that these criteria can come apart, as in the case of the phenomenon of intersexuality, which in turn suggests that the bodily differences between human individuals might not constitute a clear-cut binary division. So, one easy to accept moral of this critique is that we should be more subtle and fine-grained about our categories. But I also suggested that the critique tries to go further than this, at least in two ways. By making problematic the way in which standardly understand the natural character of sex as something that's fixed or unchangeable, by emphasizing that judgments of naturalness are always value-laden and indexed to a specific context. But note, we might still judge that there are natural differences which are more or less reliably separate a male category of humans from a female category. But the important thing for the feminist critic is that we have overcome a simplistic understanding presupposed in standard uses of the sex-gender distinction. Another related point that seems to follow from the feminist criticism of the distinction between sex and gender is that whatever natural features and distinctions we do take to exist, There is an additional question whether these features and differences are appropriate markers to draw the dividing lines of a political taxonomy. After all, there is a natural division between redheads and others, and still we don't take that to be as significant as the male-female distinction. But what does all of this tell us about the question, what is a woman? Which can translate also into the question of what is the subject matter of feminism? Well, the sex-gender distinction promised an apparently simple answer. We might either be talking about a sex or about a gender. Most likely about the gender, as the term woman is generally regarded as a gender term and the term female as a sex term. But the feminist critique of the sex-gender distinction complicates things. The kinds of markers that are conventionally counted as belonging to sex might fail to pick out women in a way that's adequate to feminist purposes because they would leave out people who seem to have a good claim to be within the scope of the feminist concern. People such as some intersex and trans women who are classed as women or girls in their everyday lives, who identify themselves as women and who are oppressed as women. But defining women exclusively in terms of gender seems problematic too. Since gender is conventionally defined in relation to the category of sex, it would also fail to include in the feminist movement those who fail to exhibit the stock traits and characteristics designated as feminine. Think of masculine women, would not be included in the feminist movement if one follows rigidly the definition of woman in terms of gender. One radical response to this might be to ditch the terms altogether: sex, gender, and also women. Instead of arguing for the liberation of women, we would just refuse to acknowledge the category, and the category of men with that. Whether this is appealing or not will depend in part on the extent to which you think it makes sense to recognize two basic groupings of humans, men and women. But the reason why most feminists still talk about the category of women, even those who profess not to believe in it, is that sex and gender terms such as woman, whatever we think they refer to in the world, are bound up with a system of practices which degrade and subordinate the people that are used to designate. So that, to the extent that sex or gender is a fiction, it is a harmful one, just like race. At the same time, these practices are enough to make womanhood something real, something about which feminists need to be able to talk about. The refusal to use sex or gender terms would make it virtually impossible for us to talk about what we want to talk about. Assuming that patriarchy is not going to dissolve just through our boycotting, whether spontaneously or systematically and gradually, the language of sex and sex differences, feminists have little choice but to deal with it, and to deal with it in these terms. But what are we talking about? Saying that we have reasons for talking about women, or for using these terms, is not the same as giving an account of what the term means or what it refers to in the world. As I already suggested, giving such an account is problematic. Framing the account in terms of sex or gender runs into some of the problems I mentioned before and seems not to be working for the purposes of the feminist movement. Another suggestion has been to define what it is to be a woman in terms of a shared set of experiences that unites an otherwise diverse and disparate group. This idea has been criticized by some as well, since differences of race, social class, and sexuality among women may be so profound that there is no single experience or set of experiences which all women share. So the project of finding and experiencing the golden nugget of womanness seems doomed as well. Yet other feminists have suggested that if there is anything general which may be said about what women are, then that something is something about their position in society, the respect and esteem which they are, or rather not, given. According to some radical feminists, being a woman is to belong to a subordinate social caste. Sure, there are other subordinate castes and groups, other than women. So this is not a proper definition, but it is a promising suggestion as to what kind of category the category of woman is. So, women are those who are oppressed as women. I know, the specter of circularity looms large. How can we define women as those who are oppressed as women when the whole point was that we are trying to work out what women are? But the suggestion is that our best political guess in answering the question of what is a woman is to say that we know fairly well who is a woman. After all, if we wouldn't know that, how would we know who to subordinate? The most general lesson from this loose discussion about sex and gender is perhaps a warning against the pitfalls that feminists must try to avoid both in their political struggles and in their theorizing. One should try to avoid repeating a patriarchal mantra that the difference between men and women at the most fundamental level is a natural one, where natural is understood as somehow a pre-social and pre-political category. If we stick to that standard interpretation, we will be bound to say that some things are nature and some things are nurture, and that nature sets what nurture can achieve. On the other hand, there are problems also with contrast with the view which sees gender as something infinitely malleable, as it can be exploited politically precisely against the interests of those people it was designed to protect. And then there is the option of using the term sex and gender more loosely and more or less interchangeably, without assuming that sex is the more natural of the two categories. Rather, this usage would be justified by the conviction that sex or gender is never just natural, physical or biological, and never just social or political, but always simultaneously both. Both natural and biologistic and also social categories can be used to capture what it means to be female and male, women and men in different contexts, and we might want to appeal to one of these criteria in a certain context, for instance in a medical context, and to use another criteria in a different sort of context, such as negotiating social practices. Giving a dogmatic preference or primacy to either conception is equally liable to contribute oppressive social practices.